Every few years, a single archaeological discovery threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the past. By the end of this journey through 30 unsolved mysteries, you will see history not as a fixed story, but as a living puzzle waiting to be solved. These are not minor gaps in our knowledge. They are core puzzles about ancient civilizations, technologies, and events that could overturn entire chapters of our shared story. What if the oldest temple ever found was built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture existed? Or that a lost Roman object still defies every explanation we have? What do you think is the most important mystery still buried beneath our feet? One site in Turkey has challenged everything we thought about early humans. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and it dates back roughly 11,000 years. That is more than 6,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt. When archaeologists first uncovered its massive stone circles in the 1990s, they could barely believe what they were seeing. The stones were carved and arranged with precision, each weighing several tons. And here is the shocker. The people who built it had no metal tools, no writing, no pottery, and no farms. They were hunter-gatherers living in small mobile groups. The conventional story says that complex monuments like this only appear after agriculture allows people to settle in large, organized communities. Yet Göbekli Tepe flips that order. The builders came together somehow to quarry, shape, and transport these enormous pillars, arrange them in concentric rings, and then, centuries later, deliberately bury the entire site. Why? That is the mystery. The leading theories suggest it was a ritual center, perhaps a place where different bands of hunter-gatherers met for ceremonies, feasts, or shared beliefs. Some researchers see astronomical alignments in the carvings on the pillars, hinting that it might have served as an observatory to track stars or seasons. Others argue it was a neutral meeting ground for trade or conflict resolution, but no single explanation has won universal acceptance. What makes this truly revolutionary is what it means for our understanding of human history. If hunter-gatherers could coordinate such a massive project without permanent settlements or rulers, then the rise of civilization may not have been driven by agriculture alone. Perhaps shared spiritual purpose was the real spark. Solving the riddle of Göbekli Tepe could redraw the timeline of the Neolithic Revolution, the very period when humans first began farming and living in villages. And the most intriguing part is that less than 10% of the site has been excavated. The answers may still be buried, waiting to be uncovered. Half a world away, a different kind of puzzle has left researchers baffled for nearly a century. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, was one of the three great Bronze Age societies alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. At its height, around 4,000 years ago, it covered an area larger than both of those other two combined. Its cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were laid out on precise grid patterns with advanced drainage systems that put many later societies to shame. The people built standardized brick houses, had public wells, and even constructed the world's first known public bath. They traded with distant lands, produced exquisite jewelry and seals, and created a system of weights and measures that was remarkably accurate. Yet for all this sophistication, one thing has remained stubbornly elusive: their writing. The Indus script appears on thousands of seals and pottery fragments, but no one has managed to decipher it. Without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, the language and the thoughts of these people remain locked away. Then came the mystery of their disappearance. Around 1900 BC, the urban centers began to decline. The great cities were gradually abandoned and the population dispersed into smaller villages. The question is why. For decades, scholars have proposed several major theories, but none has emerged as a clear winner. The climate change theory suggests that a long-term shift in weather patterns caused the monsoon rains to weaken, drying up the rivers that sustained agriculture and trade. Evidence from ancient lake beds and river sediments supports a period of severe drought. Another theory points to river shifts. The Indus and its tributaries, especially the Gagga-Hakra river system, changed course multiple times due to tectonic activity. When the rivers moved, the cities that depended on them lost their water supply and their trade routes. A third theory, once popular, the idea of an invasion by nomadic peoples from the north, has largely been abandoned because there is no archaeological evidence of widespread destruction or conflict. The fourth theory is internal collapse, overexploitation of resources, deforestation, soil salinization from irrigation, or a breakdown of the central authority that coordinated the cities. Each of these ideas has merit, but none alone accounts for the full pattern of gradual decline and the lack of a dramatic endpoint. The cities were not sacked. They were not burned, they were simply left behind. Many researchers now believe that the undeciphered Indus script may hold the missing key. If we could read the seals and inscriptions, we might discover how Harappan society was organized, what their rulers or priests commanded, and perhaps even how they responded to environmental stress. The script could reveal records of trade agreements, religious rituals, or emergency decrees that explain why the population chose to abandon their carefully planned cities. Without that key, the story remains incomplete. Understanding why the Indus Valley civilization collapsed matters beyond mere historical curiosity. It offers a powerful lesson for our own time. Here was a society that built some of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, with a strong economy, long-distance trade, and organized governance. Yet it could not adapt to gradual environmental changes. The same combination of shifting climate, resource strain, and societal inflexibility threatens modern civilizations today. So as we wonder what happened to those ancient people, we might also wonder what warnings their silent cities hold for us. Few historical figures remain as shrouded in mystery as Cleopatra. For nearly 2,000 years, the location of her final resting place has been one of archaeology's most tantalizing puzzles. Historical accounts from the Roman era tell us that she was buried alongside Mark Antony in a grand tomb somewhere in or near the ancient city of Alexandria. The tomb was said to be a lavish structure filled with treasures befitting the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, but after her loss and the Roman takeover, the tomb disappeared from the historical record. Over the centuries, Alexandria suffered repeated natural disasters. Earthquakes shook the coastline, tsunamis swept in, and the entire area slowly sank as the sea level rose. Much of the ancient city now lies submerged beneath the Mediterranean waters, and the original coastline has shifted inland by several kilometers. This means the tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, if it still exists, is almost certainly underwater or buried deep beneath later construction. Recent underwater excavations in the harbor of Alexandria have yielded astonishing discoveries. Archaeologists have found statues, sphinxes, columns, and even fragments of what may have been a royal temple. In 2009, a team led by Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican archaeologist, began exploring a site near Alexandria called Taposiris Magna, a temple complex dedicated to the god Osiris. The team uncovered a cemetery with mummies that had gold foil on their faces and elaborate burial masks, suggesting they were high-status individuals from the Ptolemaic period. They also found a series of tunnels and shafts that may lead to deeper chambers, but no definitive tomb has been found. The challenge is immense. The search area is vast, much of it covered by modern buildings or hidden under murky water. The clues are fragmentary, yet the potential reward is enormous. Finding Cleopatra's tomb would not only solve a 2-millennia-old mystery, it would provide a direct window into the final days of Hellenistic Egypt, a time when Greek and Egyptian cultures blended in fascinating ways. The tomb might contain papyrus scrolls, royal regalia, and artifacts that could rewrite our understanding of the last pharaoh and her relationship with Rome. It could also reveal new details about the transition from the pharaonic era to Roman rule, a pivotal moment that reshaped the entire Mediterranean world. Until the waters give up their secret, the Queen remains lost, and the search continues to captivate explorers and historians alike. What might lie buried beneath the silt, waiting to be found? In 1901, a group of sponge divers off the coast of the small Greek island of Antikythera stumbled upon something extraordinary. Resting among the remains of a sunken Roman ship, they found a corroded lump of bronze that would become one of the most bewildering objects ever recovered from antiquity. It took decades of patient study before researchers realized what they were holding: an ancient Greek astronomical calculator, a device so intricate that its complexity was not matched until the Renaissance. Today, we call it the Antikythera mechanism. Its basic purpose is now understood. Through X-ray imaging and computer modeling, scientists have determined that it was a hand-operated device with a series of interlocking gears that tracked the movements of the sun and moon. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses, calculate the dates of important events like the Olympic Games, and even model the irregular orbit of the moon. But here is where the mystery deepens. The mechanism is incomplete. Several fragments, including a large portion of the front face, are missing, and those missing pieces may have held functions far more advanced than anything we have confirmed. Some scholars argue that the full version of the device could track the positions of all 5 planets known to the Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Others believe it could simulate the entire cosmos, showing the rising and setting of constellations across the seasons. The debate revolves around the interpretation of faint inscriptions and the arrangement of shattered gears. Without the missing parts, the mechanism remains a puzzle with gaps. What is certain is that no other device of comparable sophistication has ever been found from the ancient world. Nothing even close. That raises a profound question. Was this a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, built by a lone genius like Archimedes or Hipparchus? Or does its existence point to a whole tradition of precision mechanics that has since been lost? If the latter, then our view of ancient Greek science may be dramatically incomplete. Consider this: the technology required to cut such tiny gears, to fit them into a compact box, to design a system that accounted for the moon's elliptical orbit, would not re-emerge in Europe until the great mechanical clocks of the 14th century. How did the Greeks achieve this so early, and why did such knowledge vanish? The shipwreck that carried the mechanism sank around 60 BC. It likely came from the island of Rhodes, a center of astronomy and engineering. But the device itself may have been decades or even centuries old when it was lost. The unanswered questions multiply. Could the mechanism predict eclipses with enough accuracy to guide military campaigns or religious rituals? Could it have been used to cast horoscopes? Was it a teaching tool, a navigational aid, or a philosophical model of the heavens? Each new analysis offers a slightly different theory, but no single explanation has silenced the debate. The Antikythera mechanism stands as a lonely testament to a level of ancient technical skill that we are only now beginning to appreciate, and it makes us wonder what else might be lying, corroded and forgotten, on the floors of the world's oceans, waiting for a pair of sponge divers to bring it back into the light. Not every mystery lies underwater. Some are etched into stone, their stories preserved in the words of ancient enemies. In the late 13th century BC, the ancient world unraveled. Across the eastern Mediterranean, empires that had stood for centuries fell one after another. The Hittite Empire vanished, Mycenaean palaces burned. The great city of Ugarit was destroyed. Egypt itself barely survived, battered and diminished. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III describe the attackers as a coalition of peoples from the sea. They called them the Sea Peoples. The hieroglyphs list their names: the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Peliset, the Tjeka, the Denyon, and others. They came from islands and distant coasts, bringing their families and belongings as if seeking new lands to settle. Ramesses claimed a great victory, but the threat never fully went away. And then, after a few decades, the Sea Peoples simply vanished from the historical record. Who were they? That is the mystery that has haunted scholars for over a century. The Egyptian texts tell us what they did, but not where they came from. The leading theories point to several possible homelands. Some researchers link the Peliset to the Philistines, who are thought to have originated in the Aegean, perhaps Crete or mainland Greece. The Shurden may have come from Sardinia, or maybe the other way around. The island was named after them. The Shekelesh have been associated with Sicily. Others propose Anatolia, the region of modern Turkey, or the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. But no single origin fits all groups. They were likely a loose confederation of different peoples, drawn together by shifting circumstances: famine, climate change, the collapse of trade networks, or pressure from other migrating groups. Without a shared written language or a central homeland, their identity remains fragmented and deeply uncertain. Even more puzzling is their sudden disappearance. After the wars with Egypt, the Sea Peoples seem to have settled in various areas. Some became mercenaries. Others formed new communities along the coast of Canaan, including the Philistine cities like Gaza and Ashdod. But the larger coalition that had threatened the great empires dissolved without explanation. They did not leave behind a single kingdom or a unified culture. Their legacy is scattered across pottery styles, weapon types, and place names that hint at their presence without revealing their story. Solving the mystery of the Sea Peoples would do more than satisfy historical curiosity. It would clarify the entire chain reaction of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period when interconnected societies fell like dominoes. Were the Sea Peoples a cause of that collapse or a symptom? Did they move because their own homelands were ruined by drought and famine? Or were they opportunistic raiders who exploited a system already breaking down? The answer could reshape our understanding of how complex civilizations rise and fall, and what happens when global networks fracture. Until new evidence emerges, perhaps from shipwrecks or undiscovered inscriptions, the Sea Peoples remain a shadowy force in history, their faces turned away, their names spoken only by the enemies they defeated. When entire civilizations crumbled within a single lifetime, history recorded the event as a mystery we still struggle to explain. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a catastrophe so complete that it erased empires that had stood for centuries. The Hittite capital of Hattusha was abandoned. The great Mycenaean palaces of Greece were burned and left in ruins. The wealthy trading hub of Ugarit, a city that held diplomatic archives connecting the known world, was destroyed so thoroughly that its very location was forgotten for 3,000 years. Egypt, though weakened, survived, but the old order had ended. This was the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most debated puzzles in archaeology. For decades, researchers have put forward a range of theories to explain what happened, but no single theory fits all the evidence. The most popular idea points to drought and climate change. Ancient tree rings and sediment cores from the region show a sudden shift toward drier conditions around that time. A prolonged megadrought could have caused widespread crop failures, leading to famine, social unrest, and the breakdown of trade networks that relied on grain shipments. The Hittites, who depended on agriculture and imported grain, may have been especially vulnerable. Another theory focuses on earthquakes. The region sits along active fault lines, and archaeological layers from several sites show signs of simultaneous seismic damage. A series of powerful quakes, perhaps over a few decades, could have toppled walls, shattered palaces, and disrupted infrastructure beyond repair. A third idea involves the migration of entire populations, including the sea peoples, who may have been displaced by environmental pressures in their own homelands. These migrating groups would have overwhelmed weakened cities and sparked a domino effect of violence and displacement, but each of these theories has gaps. Drought alone does not explain why earthquakes hit multiple cities at once, and migration theories depend on unknown origins. Some scholars now favor a systems collapse model. In this view, the Bronze Age world was a tightly interconnected web of empires that relied on long-distance trade for essential goods like tin and copper, which were needed to make bronze. When one node failed, whether from drought, earthquake, or invasion, the entire network could unravel rapidly. The collapse was not caused by a single factor, but by the interaction of several stresses that pushed the system past a breaking point. Supporting this idea, the archaeological record shows that the collapse was not simultaneous everywhere. Some cities fell earlier, others later, but within a century, the entire international order had dissolved. The Hittite Empire vanished, leaving no written records of its end. Mycenaean civilization shrank into isolated villages, losing writing and monumental architecture. Even Egypt, which repelled the Sea Peoples, entered a long period of decline. The real question is whether the Sea Peoples were the cause or the symptom of this collapse. If they were migrating because of drought and famine in their homelands, then they were a secondary effect of the same environmental crisis that struck the empires. In that case, the collapse was driven by climate, with human conflict as a consequence. But if they were opportunistic raiders exploiting existing weaknesses, then migration and conflict were the primary drivers. The mystery matters because it speaks directly to our own times. Modern civilization is also a tightly interconnected global system, vulnerable to cascading failures from climate change, resource shortages, or economic disruptions. Studying what happened to the Bronze Age world might offer lessons for how we can build resilience. Until new discoveries, perhaps from shipwrecks or undeciphered texts, clarify the sequence of events, the collapse remains a dark mirror of our own fragile networks. And as we move to the next mystery, consider how much of what we call progress can vanish when the threads that hold it together start to snap. A different kind of mystery survives not in ruined cities or sunken ships, but in the pages of a single book. It is called the Voynich Manuscript, a codex from the 15th century that has defied every attempt to read it for over 100 years. The manuscript is small, about the size of a modern paperback, and written on vellum with elegant, flowing script that no one has ever identified. The alphabet has about 25 characters, and they appear in sequences that look like a real language, with repeated patterns and word length distributions. But what those words mean remains completely unknown. The illustrations are what make the manuscript so famous. They are bizarre and haunting, plants that do not exist in any known botanical guide, with roots and leaves that twist into impossible shapes. Naked figures bathe in green liquid, connected by pipes and tubes that resemble plumbing or alchemical apparatus. There are astrological diagrams with zodiac symbols and constellations that do not match any known sky. And at the back, a section of dense text that seems to be a recipe book for something we cannot identify. The entire thing is a puzzle box with no key. For over a century, the best minds in cryptography, linguistics, and history have tried to break it. Some believed it was a natural language, perhaps a lost dialect or an invented script for a known language like Latin or German. Others argued it was a code, a sophisticated cipher that required a key. A few even suggested it was an elaborate hoax, meaningless gibberish designed to fool a wealthy patron. But none of these theories has gained widespread acceptance. In recent years, statistical analysis has shown that the text has the same statistical properties as natural languages, such as repeated word frequencies and predictable letter combinations. That suggests it is not random, yet no one can map those patterns to any known language or encryption system. In 2019, a researcher claimed to have found evidence that the manuscript was written in Proto-Romance, an early form of Romance languages, but the translation was partial and contested. The debate remains wide open. The most intriguing possibility is that the manuscript contains lost medieval knowledge. The botanical illustrations, however strange, might represent real plants that were used for medicine or rituals in a tradition that has since disappeared. The astronomical diagrams could encode observations of the heavens from a forgotten observatory. The recipe section might hold instructions for alchemical processes that predate modern chemistry. If the Voynich manuscript could be read, it might reveal a whole branch of medieval science that was never recorded anywhere else. That would reshape our understanding of what medieval scholars knew about nature, medicine, and the universe. But there is another possibility, equally revolutionary. The manuscript might be a deliberate piece of cryptographic art, a proof of concept from a time when encryption was emerging as a tool for diplomacy and warfare. If that is true, then the Voynich could represent the earliest known example of a sophisticated cipher system, predating the famous codes of the Renaissance. Deciphering it would rewrite the history of cryptography and show that medieval thinkers were far more advanced in information security than we ever imagined. Some archaeologists and historians who study the manuscript believe its botanical and astronomical content may have roots in even older traditions. The strange plants could be symbolic representations of plants from the classical world, drawn from lost works of Pliny or Dioscorides. The water imagery might reflect ancient Greek theories about the four elements. In that case, the Voynich is not just a medieval mystery, but a link to knowledge that passed through Byzantium, the Islamic world, and back to Europe, a chain of transmission that we can only dimly perceive. Until someone finds the key, the manuscript sits in the Baghdad Rare Book Library at Yale University, a silent testament to how much of the past remains closed to us. Its pages turn only for researchers who stare at the elegant loops and curls of a language that refuses to speak. On a windswept plain in southern England, an arrangement of standing stones has puzzled observers for nearly 1,000 years. Stonehenge is perhaps the most famous prehistoric monument in the world, and yet its construction remains one of engineering's greatest unsolved riddles. The central puzzle is deceptively simple. How did Neolithic people, using only stone tools and rope, transport and erect massive blocks weighing up to 50 tons each, some from quarries more than 200 miles away? The largest stones, the Sarsen giants, were brought from the Marlborough Downs about 20 miles to the north. That alone would be a formidable challenge today. But the smaller bluestones, which form the inner circle and the horseshoe, came from the Preseli Hills in western Wales, a distance of over 150 miles. How they moved these 4-ton blocks across such rugged terrain, over rivers and hills without wheels or metal, is the kind of question that has driven archaeologists to build full-scale replicas and conduct experiments for decades. The leading theories fall into several groups. The first involves sledges and rollers. Workers may have placed the stones on wooden sledges and dragged them over log rollers, a method used by many ancient cultures. Experiments have shown that a team of about 100 people could move a 4-ton stone this way, though the effort is enormous and requires a smooth, prepared surface. The second theory proposes that the builders used waterways wherever possible. The bluestones could have been transported by boat along the coast of Wales and then up the River Avon, which flows near Stonehenge. This would have reduced the overland distance and the required manpower, but the rivers are not deep enough in many places, and the stones would have needed to be unloaded and reloaded several times. A third theory involves wooden frameworks and lever systems to raise the stones into their upright positions. The lintels, the horizontal stones that cap the uprights, would have been lifted into place using a system of ramps and levers, or perhaps by building a crib of logs and then sliding the stone into position. Reconstructions have shown this is possible, but it requires precise coordination and a deep understanding of leverage and weight distribution. Despite decades of experiments and computer simulations, no single method has been proven as the definitive technique. Each approach has its strengths and its flaws. The sledges leave no trace on the landscape, but they require a huge labor force. The water route is plausible but depends on seasonal flooding and specific river conditions. The wooden frameworks are conceptually sound but leave no archaeological evidence. The truth is that we may never know exactly how it was done because the builders left no written records, and the landscape has changed dramatically over 4,500 years. The mystery deepens when we consider the purpose of the monument. Why did these people invest such immense effort? The most popular theory is that Stonehenge was an astronomical observatory, aligned to the summer and winter solstices. The main axis points toward the sunrise on the longest day of the year, suggesting it was used to mark the seasons, but there is no evidence that it was used for precise celestial measurements. A second theory sees it as a ritual site, a place for ceremonies, burials, and communal gatherings. The surrounding landscape is filled with burial mounds and other ceremonial structures, suggesting it was part of a larger sacred landscape. A third theory proposes that it was a healing center. The blue stones, which are rich in minerals, were believed by some to have medicinal properties, and the remains of some of the people buried there show signs of injury or illness. Each theory has supporters, but none has achieved consensus. The true purpose may have been a combination of all three, or something we have not yet imagined. If we could ever answer how and why Stonehenge was built, it would transform our understanding of Neolithic society. It would show that prehistoric people had sophisticated engineering knowledge, the ability to coordinate large workforces over long distances, and a shared belief system strong enough to motivate such a massive undertaking. That would rewrite the story of human innovation, pushing back the timeline of organized labor and monumental architecture by thousands of years. Until that day, the stones stand silent, their secrets held in the weight of time itself. Far above the desert floor, the Nazca lines remain one of the most breathtaking puzzles ever etched into the earth. Stretching across nearly 200 square miles of the Peruvian coastal plain, these geoglyphs depict everything from hummingbirds and monkeys to spirals and trapezoids, some measuring hundreds of feet across. Their sheer scale is staggering. The largest figures are over 1,200 feet long, and they are best seen from the air, a vantage point that the Nazca people, who created them between 500 BC and 500 CE, never had. How they planned and executed such precise lines without an aerial perspective is a mystery in itself. But the deeper question is why? What purpose drove generations to scrape away the dark desert stone to reveal the lighter ground beneath, creating shapes that would only reveal their full form to the gods above? The most popular interpretation points to astronomy. Many of the lines align with the positions of the sun, moon, and stars at key dates like the solstices. Some researchers believe the Nazca used these alignments as a giant calendar to track the seasons for agriculture, but the evidence is inconsistent. Not all figures align with celestial events, and the alignments that do exist could be coincidental. A second theory ties the lines to water rituals. The Nazca people lived in one of the driest regions on Earth, where water was scarce and unpredictable. The geoglyphs may have marked paths to sacred wells or springs, or they might have been part of ceremonies meant to summon rain. The lines often start and end near dry riverbeds, and the shapes include spirals and zigzags that could represent flowing water or lightning. A third idea sees them as ceremonial walkways. The straight lines, some stretching for miles, could have been processional routes for religious pilgrimages. Walking along them might have been a form of meditation or a way to connect with the spirits of the ancestors. Each interpretation has its champions, but without written records from the Nazca culture, every explanation remains a well-reasoned guess. The mystery goes beyond mere curiosity. The Nazca lines represent a world you carved directly into the landscape, a message from a people who had no written language but left behind one of the most monumental records of belief ever created. If we could understand why they built these immense figures, we might glimpse the cosmology, the rituals, and the social structure of an Andean civilization that flourished for over 1,000 years. We might learn how they viewed the heavens, how they negotiated with the forces of nature, and what they believed about their place in the universe. Until then, the hummingbird and the spider and the monkey lie silent under the desert sky, watched only by passing satellites and the occasional tour flight. They wait for someone to read what the earth is saying. On the coast of North Carolina, a single word carved into a wooden post has haunted historians for over 400 years. The settlement was the first English attempt at a permanent colony in North America. In 1587, around 115 men, women, and children landed on Roanoke Island, off what is now the Outer Banks. Their governor, John White, returned to England for supplies, but when he came back in 1590, the colony was empty. The houses had been dismantled, not destroyed. There were no signs of struggle or violence. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a fence post and the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree. The word referred to a nearby island and the Native American tribe that lived there. John White had told the colonists that if they were forced to move, they should carve the name of their destination. But he was never able to follow the lead. A storm prevented him from sailing to Croatoan, and he returned to England, never to see his family again. Over the centuries, countless theories have emerged. The most widely accepted idea is that the colonists integrated peacefully with the Croatoan tribe or other neighboring groups. Oral histories from local Native American communities, including the Lumbee and the Hatteras, tell of ancestors with light skin and English names, suggesting intermarriage and assimilation. Archaeological digs on nearby islands have uncovered English artifacts, such as a copper ring and a fragment of a sword, mixed with Native American tools and pottery. These finds hint at trade and coexistence, but not at a resettled colony. Another theory proposes that the colonists moved inland, perhaps to the mainland along the Chowan River, following a drought that made coastal life impossible. Excavations at the site of a small fort called Site X have revealed European-style pottery and a lead pencil that matches ones used by English colonists. But no definitive evidence of a large settlement has been found. A third, darker theory suggests that the colonists were killed by hostile tribes, or that they died from disease or starvation after failing to adapt. Yet the lack of remains, no mass graves, no skeletal evidence from that time, makes this hard to prove. The real mystery is the absence of a clear end. Every generation of archaeologists has applied new tools: ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, tree ring dating, even DNA testing of local populations. Each has turned up tantalizing fragments, but never a complete picture. The colonists did not vanish without a trace. They vanished without a story. What makes this mystery so compelling is what it would mean if solved. If the Roanoke colonists were absorbed into Native American societies, it would change our understanding of early contact between Europeans and indigenous peoples. It would show a path of coexistence rather than conflict, a moment when two worlds blended instead of collided. That narrative would reshape the entire founding myth of English America. On the other hand, if they perished in a desperate attempt to survive, it would reveal the brutal reality of colonization long before Jamestown or Plymouth. Either way, the answer lies in the ground, waiting for the right combination of technology and luck. Until then, the word Croatoan remains both a clue and an epitaph, carved into history but never fully read. Deep in a limestone cliff in southern France, a chamber of images remained hidden for 36,000 years. In 1994, 3 speleologists stumbled upon the entrance to what is now known as the Chauvet Cave, and what they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about early human creativity. The walls are covered with hundreds of paintings, including horses, bison, woolly rhinoceroses, lions, and bears, all rendered with a fluidity and realism that would not be matched for tens of thousands of years. Some animals are shown in motion, their legs overlapping to suggest running. Others appear in groups, interacting in ways that hint at narratives, a pride of lions stalking a herd of bison, or a rhinoceros charging at an unseen threat. The artists used the natural contours of the rock to give the animals volume, and they even employed a form of perspective, painting certain figures higher up to suggest depth. All of this was done with charcoal and mineral pigments, by people who lived at the very end of the last ice age. The sophistication is breathtaking, but it raises a question that archaeologists have debated ever since. What were these paintings for? One theory sees them as part of shamanistic rituals, where the cave itself was a sacred space, a passage between the ordinary world and the spirit world. The animals might have represented spirit guides or totems, and the act of painting them could have been a way to harness their power. The deep, echoing chambers, the flickering light of torches, the smell of smoke and earth, all would have created an immersive experience. Another theory argues that the paintings are not just random images but tell specific stories. Some researchers see repeated motifs in the arrangement of animals, such as a confrontation between predators and prey, that might have been a form of oral tradition frozen in pigment. If true, these are the earliest known narratives, predating written language by 30 millennia. A third view holds that the paintings were purely decorative, an expression of aesthetic pleasure with no deeper spiritual or narrative meaning. Yet the sheer effort involved, the careful selection of which animals to paint, and the deliberate sealing of the cave entrance all suggest that the chamber was no ordinary dwelling. The cave was not a living space. It was a sanctuary, a place set apart. The people who created these images walked away and sealed the entrance, and the cave remained undisturbed for over 30,000 years, preserving the paintings in near-perfect condition. This discovery challenges the idea that human cultural evolution was a steady march from primitive to complex. If early Homo sapiens could produce art of this caliber at the dawn of their existence, then the capacity for symbolic thought, for abstract imagination, for storytelling, may have been present from the very beginning. That changes how we think about the human mind. It suggests that the seeds of civilization were not planted slowly over millennia, but were already flowering in the deep past, hidden in caves like Chauvet, waiting for the light of our own time. What did those artists believe they were doing when they painted a charging rhinoceros by the flicker of a tallow lamp? And what does their work tell us about the universal human impulse to leave a mark beyond the brief span of a single life? The greatest secret of the Mongol Empire may still lie hidden beneath the soil of a remote mountain range. Genghis Khan, the founder of one of the largest land empires in history, died in 1227, and according to legend, his final resting place was deliberately concealed to protect it from looters and enemies. The story goes that his funeral procession killed every person and animal they encountered along the way, so that no one could ever reveal the location. The site itself was then covered with earth and trampled by horses, and a river was even diverted over the grave to erase all traces. For nearly 800 years, that location has remained one of history's most enduring secrets. Modern efforts to find the tomb have been both persistent and ingenious. Archaeologists and researchers have used satellite imagery to scan the vast landscape of the Kentai Mountains in northeastern Mongolia, where most historical texts suggest the tomb may lie. Ground-penetrating radar has probed the soil for hidden chambers or anomalies. Teams have studied ancient Chinese and Persian chronicles, searching for any hint of the route the funeral procession took. Yet despite all this technology and scholarship, no excavation has ever been permitted. The Mongolian government, respecting the wishes of the local people and the deep spiritual significance of the site, has placed a strict ban on any digging that might disturb the emperor's resting place. What makes this mystery so compelling is not just the legend but the potential reward. If the tomb were ever found and carefully excavated, it would be an archaeological treasure beyond compare. Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes of the steppe, created a legal code, established a postal system, and opened trade routes across Asia. His tomb would likely contain not only his personal possessions but also the wealth of the entire empire: gold, silk, weapons, and perhaps even the lost records of the Mongol court, which have never been recovered. Such a discovery would transform our understanding of how a small group of herders built the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. It would reveal the burial rituals of the Mongol elite, the craftsmanship of their artisans, and the symbols of authority that held the empire together. Until the ban is lifted or a non-invasive method can confirm the exact location, the emperor lies in silence under the Mongolian sky, his grave still protected by the same secrecy that served him in life. Not far from the lands where Genghis Khan's tomb may rest, a much smaller mystery has baffled archaeologists across Europe. The Roman Dodecahedron is a hollow bronze object about the size of a tennis ball, with 12 flat faces and a circular hole of different size on each face. Small knobs sit at the corners where the faces meet. Over 100 of these objects have been found, scattered from England to Hungary, yet not a single ancient text mentions them, nor does any known work of Roman art depict one in use. The first clue that deepens the puzzle is the complete absence of standardization. No two dodecahedrons share the same dimensions, the same arrangement of hole sizes, or the same weight. Some are elegantly finished with ornate detailing, others rough and plain. This immediately rules out a simple universal tool, like a standard measuring device or a standard military fitting. Over the centuries, scholars have proposed an astonishing range of explanations, each plausible but none proven. One theory holds that it was a surveying instrument, perhaps a rangefinder for Roman legions laying out camps or roads. The different-sized holes could have been used to sight distant objects and calculate distances. Yet no other known Roman surveying tool looks anything like this, and no military manual describes such a device. Another popular idea suggests it was a knitting tool, specifically used to create the fingers of woolen gloves or the mesh of chain mail. The holes could help gauge the spacing of stitches or shape the fabric. But no surviving Roman textiles show patterns that would require such an object, and the dodecahedron's weight and rigidity seem impractical for continuous handwork. A third theory sees it as a candle holder. A wax candle would be placed in one of the holes and the object set on a flat surface, the knobs acting as feet. The multiple hole sizes could accommodate different candle diameters. This seems plausible for domestic use, but why the elaborate 12-sided shape? Simple pottery or metal stands would have been far easier to produce. A fourth interpretation leans toward a religious or ceremonial function. The geometric perfection of the dodecahedron, a shape associated with the universe in Platonic philosophy, might have been used in private rituals as a protective charm or as a symbol of cosmic order. Its frequent discovery in graves and near temples supports this, but no inscription or artwork confirms any sacred purpose. The real frustration is that the Romans themselves left behind countless manuals, letters, and records on everything from plumbing to siege engines, yet not a single word describes this object. In a culture that documented its engineering achievements so thoroughly, the dodecahedron remains a silent outlier. Solving this puzzle would not just satisfy curiosity. It would open a window onto a lost aspect of Roman daily life, perhaps a domestic craft, a military technique, or a spiritual practice that has vanished without a trace. Until a lucky archaeologist finds a dodecahedron still holding a candle, or wrapped in a fragment of knitted wool, or inscribed with a dedication to a forgotten goddess, the little bronze enigma will continue to sit in museum drawers, waiting for someone to understand what hands once held it and why. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing several tons on average. The entire structure was completed in roughly 20 years. That means the ancient Egyptians had to quarry, transport, and lift one block into place every few minutes, working day and night for 2 decades straight. No modern construction company would attempt such a feat today without advanced machinery, and yet the builders of the Old Kingdom did it using only copper tools, wooden levers, and rope. The question of how they managed this has haunted engineers and archaeologists for centuries. Several major theories have been proposed, and each one has its strengths and its weaknesses. The oldest and most straightforward idea is the straight external ramp. According to this theory, the Egyptians built a massive ramp of earth and stone, sloping upward from the base of the pyramid. Workers would drag the blocks up this ramp on wooden sledges, and as the pyramid grew taller, the ramp would be extended and raised. The problem is that a ramp long enough to reach the top of the pyramid, with a gentle enough slope to be practical, would have required more material than the pyramid itself. Some calculations suggest it would have been nearly a mile long and would have taken years just to build and then dismantle. The landscape around Giza shows no trace of such an enormous structure, nor evidence of the millions of tons of rubble that would have been left behind. To solve the space problem, some scholars proposed a spiral ramp that wrapped around the pyramid like a road climbing a mountain. The ramp would be built on top of the pyramid itself, winding upward as the structure rose. This would use far less material and leave no trace on the surrounding ground. However, a spiral ramp would have blocked the corners of the pyramid, making it impossible to check the alignment and precision of the edges. The casing stones, which were fitted with incredible accuracy, would have had to be set after the ramp was removed, leaving no room for error. No archaeological evidence of such a ramp has ever been found, and the logistics of turning the blocks around tight corners on a steep incline are daunting. A more recent and ingenious theory suggests that the Egyptians used an internal ramp built inside the pyramid. French architect Jean-Pierre Houdon proposed that a tunnel-like ramp spirals up within the pyramid, hidden behind the outer casing stones. Workers would pull the blocks through this internal corridor, which was open to the sky at the top during construction. The theory is supported by a slight indentation visible on the pyramid face, which could mark the location of a turning point for the ramp. Scans have detected anomalies that might correspond to such a void, but no excavation has confirmed it. The internal ramp would solve the problems of space and visibility, but it raises its own questions about how the blocks were maneuvered within a narrow passage and how the ceiling was supported as the pyramid grew. The fourth major theory relies on water. The Nile River flowed much closer to the Giza Plateau in ancient times. Some researchers argue that the Egyptians built a system of canals and locks to float the stones from the quarries right up to the building site. Blocks were loaded onto barges raised with water lifts and then positioned using hydraulics. This would explain the precision of the joints and the weight distribution, as water provides a near-frictionless method of moving heavy objects. However, no evidence of such a complex water system has been found, and the amount of water needed would have been enormous in a desert climate. The technique would also require a level of hydraulic engineering that we do not see in any other Old Kingdom project. Each of these theories explains some aspect of the construction, but none perfectly matches all the evidence left behind. The quarry marks, the tool marks on the blocks, the arrangement of the chambers, the lack of ramp debris, and the astonishing speed of construction all point to a method we have not yet fully reconstructed. What makes the mystery so compelling is not just the size of the pyramid but the precision. The base is leveled to within less than an inch across its entire length. The sides align almost exactly to the cardinal directions. The casing stones were cut with such accuracy that a piece of paper cannot fit between them. Achieving this with copper tools and manual labor is a feat that challenges our assumptions about ancient capabilities. If a definitive answer were ever found, it would rewrite our understanding of Old Kingdom technology and organization. The building method would reveal how the Egyptians managed labor on an unprecedented scale, how they coordinated thousands of workers, and what kinds of tools and techniques they possessed that have since been lost. It would also tell us something about the society that could conceive and execute such a project, the level of central planning, the system of record-keeping, the specialization of craftsmen, and the social incentives that drove such a tremendous effort. Until that answer comes, the Great Pyramid stands as a silent challenge to every generation of engineers, a puzzle carved in stone that refuses to yield its secret. And as we stand at its base, we are forced to ask, what else have we underestimated about the minds and hands that built the ancient world? While the stones of Giza guard their builder's secret, another vanished presence in the human story leaves an even deeper silence. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals thrived across Europe and Asia. They were skilled hunters, toolmakers, and survivors of harsh Ice Age winters. Their brains were, on average, larger than our own. They buried their dead, cared for their injured, and perhaps even practiced symbolic rituals. And then, after modern humans arrived on the scene, they disappeared. The last known Neanderthal remains date to around 40,000 years ago, though some sites may push that date slightly earlier or later. The timing is the first clue. Their decline closely matches the spread of Homo sapiens into their territories. But the cause of that decline is far from settled. One of the most discussed explanations is direct competition. Modern humans were more numerous, more adaptable, and possibly more efficient at extracting resources from the landscape. They might have outcompeted Neanderthals for game, for shelter, for the best hunting grounds. Some evidence suggests that modern humans had more complex social networks and traded over long distances, giving them a resilience that isolated Neanderthal groups lacked. But competition alone does not account for the speed of the disappearance. Another theory points to climate change. The Ice Age was punctuated by rapid swings in temperature and rainfall. Neanderthals had survived these shifts for millennia, but perhaps the arrival of modern humans pushed them into marginal environments just as climate worsened, creating a double bind from which they could not recover. Genetic studies add another layer. We now know that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Most people of European and Asian descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, usually between 1 and 2%. That is clear evidence of contact and of at least some peaceful interaction. But the low percentage also tells us that interbreeding was limited. It did not result in a blended population that absorbed the Neanderthals. Instead, their genetic signature is a faint echo, a trace of meetings that never led to full integration. What remains uncertain is the final chapter. Did Neanderthals slowly dwindle in small pockets, losing genetic diversity until they could no longer sustain themselves? Did they fall victim to diseases brought by modern humans to which they had no immunity, or were they actively displaced through conflict, though evidence of large-scale battles is absent from the archaeological record? Each hypothesis has its supporters and each has its weaknesses. The truth may be a combination of factors that varied by region and time period. In some places, Neanderthals may have coexisted for thousands of years, while in others they disappeared within a few centuries. Solving this mystery is not just about satisfying curiosity about our closest ancient relatives. It would transform our understanding of what it means to be human. If Neanderthals were outcompeted, that suggests our species possessed a unique edge, perhaps cognitive flexibility or social cohesion, that allowed us to spread where others failed. If they were absorbed through interbreeding, then our lineage is more blended than we once thought, and the line between us and them is blurred. If climate change was the decisive factor, then the story of human expansion is less about superiority and more about timing and luck. Each answer rewrites the narrative of our own origins, until new fossils or ancient DNA from a critical time window clarify the sequence of events. The Neanderthals remain a silent question mark at the edge of our family tree, a reminder that every triumph carries the shadow of a loss. One vanished culture has never been found because it may never have existed. The story of Atlantis begins with the Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote around 360 BC about a powerful island civilization that sank into the ocean in a single day and night. According to his account, Atlantis was a wealthy and technologically advanced society that grew arrogant and attempted to conquer Athens, only to be defeated and then destroyed by earthquakes and floods. For over 2,000 years, this tale has inspired countless explorers, writers, and dreamers to search for a real sunken city beneath the waves of the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. But the vast majority of mainstream archaeologists and historians regard Atlantis as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale invented by Plato to illustrate the dangers of hubris and the decay of moral values. The evidence for this interpretation is strong. No ancient source outside of Plato mentions Atlantis. No geological survey has ever found a sunken landmass of that size in the location he described. And the details of the story, the advanced technology, the rise and fall, the divine punishment, fit neatly into the patterns of Greek myth and moral fable. Yet the search has never fully stopped. Some researchers have proposed that Plato may have drawn inspiration from real historical events. The most popular candidate is the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete and the nearby volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini. Around 1600 BC, Thera erupted in one of the most violent volcanic explosions in human history. The eruption caused a massive tsunami that devastated the Minoan coast, and the resulting ash cloud and climate disruption may have contributed to the decline of that sophisticated Bronze Age culture. The Minoans had advanced plumbing, elaborate palaces, and a written script that is still undeciphered. They traded across the Mediterranean and created stunning frescoes. If the memory of this lost civilization reached Plato through fragmented oral traditions, he may have woven it into his allegory, creating a story that blended fact and fiction. Another candidate is the ancient Greek city of Helike, which was destroyed by an earthquake and submerged in a lagoon in the 4th century BC, just a few decades after Plato wrote. Helike was a real place, and its sudden disappearance was widely reported, but it was a single city, not a continent-sized empire. The distinction between allegory and historical record is crucial. If Atlantis is purely a philosophical invention, then the question of its existence is settled. It never existed, and searching for it is a misunderstanding of Plato's intent. But if it does echo a real event, even a heavily mythologized one, then the mystery shifts from geography to history. Which real culture might have sparked that memory? And what does our endless fascination with a sunken golden age say about us? The question endures not because the evidence is compelling, but because the idea of a lost utopia, a perfect society that vanished in a catastrophic instant, taps into a deep human longing. We want to believe that there was once a wiser, more advanced world, and that its secrets could teach us how to build a better future. That emotional pull is powerful enough to keep the search alive, even when the evidence points to fiction. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Atlantis is not whether it existed, but why we need it to have existed. and that is a question that no dig or sonar scan can ever answer. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, the ground itself holds a hidden map. For decades, the prevailing view of the Amazon was that of a pristine wilderness, a vast and nearly empty forest where only small, nomadic tribes lived before European contact. That picture began to crack in the 1970s when pilots flying over deforested areas noticed strange geometric shapes carved into the earth. But it was only in the last 20 years, as satellite imagery and aerial surveys became widely available, that the full scale of these earthworks became clear. Hundreds of ditches, straight lines, circles, squares, and octagons stretch across the landscape, some measuring hundreds of feet across. They are called geoglyphs, and they are concentrated in the southern Amazon, particularly in the Brazilian states of Acre and Rondônia, as well as in neighboring Bolivia. The shapes are not natural. They were dug by human hands by digging trenches several feet deep and piling the earth into embankments. The sheer number of them and the coordination required to plan and build such precise patterns points to something the old view never predicted: large, settled, and organized populations living in the Amazon long before Europeans arrived. The debate among archaeologists now centers on what these geoglyphs were for. One leading theory suggests they were ceremonial spaces, places for rituals, gatherings, or astronomical observations. The geometric precision, the alignment with cardinal directions, and the lack of domestic debris inside the enclosures all support this idea. Another theory argues they were defensive fortifications. The deep ditches and high embankments could have protected villages from attack, and some sites show evidence of palisades, wooden walls built along the tops of the banks. A third idea sees them as residential or agricultural centers, where the ditches were used to manage water and soil, creating raised fields that could support intensive farming. Each interpretation has evidence, but none fits every site. The most striking fact is that the builders remain unknown. No single culture or language group has been clearly linked to these earthworks. The Amazon is a patchwork of hundreds of different societies, many of which were decimated by disease and displacement after European contact. The knowledge of who built these geoglyphs and how their society functioned was largely lost before it could be recorded. What little we know comes from fragments of pottery, carbon dating of charcoal, and the layout of the earthworks themselves. The implications for conventional history are profound. If the Amazon was home to large, complex societies, then the idea of the forest as an untouched wilderness, a Garden of Eden before humans arrived, is a myth. Instead, the landscape was actively shaped by generations of people who cleared patches, enriched the soil with charcoal, planted fruit trees, and built these monumental earthworks. They did not simply live in harmony with nature, they engineered it, understanding who they were, how they organized their labor, what beliefs drove them to carve these immense shapes into the earth, would revolutionize Amazonian archaeology. It would force a complete rewriting of the history of the Americas, placing the rainforest not on the margins but at the center of pre-Columbian civilization. Until more excavations are allowed, and until the forest gives up its secrets, these lines in the earth remain a silent testimony to a lost world of builders, thinkers, and dreamers whose names we will never know. What else might be hidden beneath the canopy, waiting for the trees to fall away? A linen cloth in Turin, Italy, has sparked a centuries-old controversy that blends faith, science, and history into a single unresolved puzzle. The Shroud of Turin is a long piece of fabric about 14 feet by 3.5 feet, bearing the faint front and back image of a man who appears to have been subjected to physical hardship. For millions of people, this cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth, the very sheet that wrapped his body after the events described in the Gospels. The image, a sepia-toned impression, shows a bearded man with wounds consistent with the crucifixion narrative, marks on the wrists, feet, and side, and a pattern of punctures around the scalp. But the question of whether the shroud is authentic, a genuine first-century relic, or a medieval creation has divided experts for decades. In 1988, a team of scientists from 3 different laboratories performed radiocarbon dating on a small sample cut from the edge of the cloth. The results pointed to a date range between 1260 and 1390, squarely in the Middle Ages. For many, this seemed to settle the matter. The shroud was a forgery, a clever piece of devotional art from the 14th century, but the story did not end there. Critics of the radiocarbon test raised a series of objections. The sample, they argued, might have been taken from a patch that was added during a medieval repair, not from the original cloth. The shroud survived a fire in 1532, and the heat and smoke could have contaminated the sample with carbon from later sources. Some researchers also pointed to a mysterious residue, a thin layer of bioplastic coating from bacteria and fungi that had grown on the fibers over centuries, which could have skewed the dating to a younger age. Each of these counterarguments has been met with rebuttals, and the scientific debate remains alive. Beyond the dating, the nature of the image itself is equally baffling. How was it created? The image is only on the topmost fibers of the cloth, barely penetrating the threads. It has no brush strokes, no pigments, and no directional flow typical of paint. It is a negative image, meaning that the faint brown impression looks like a positive when photographed in reverse, a fact first noticed by a photographer in 1898. Some scientists have proposed that the image was formed by a burst of light or heat, perhaps a form of radiation, but no controlled experiment has ever reproduced the exact characteristics of the shroud. Others suggest it was made by a technique involving iron oxide and a chemical reaction, or by a primitive form of photography using silver nitrate. Yet none of these methods have yielded a result that matches the shroud's unique properties. The debate is not just about science, it also involves history, art, and textile analysis. The fabric itself is a herringbone twill weave, a pattern that existed in the ancient world but became more common in the medieval period. Pollen grains found on the shroud have been identified as species native to the Middle East, supporting an origin in that region. But the pollen could have been deposited later, during centuries of exposure and veneration. The historical record is equally ambiguous. The first certain mention of the shroud appears in the 1350s, in the hands of a French knight. Before that, its whereabouts are unknown. However, some researchers argue that a cloth known as the Image of Edessa, a relic venerated in the Eastern Church, may have been the same object taken from Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. If that connection could be proven, it would push the known history of the shroud back by several centuries, though not all the way to the 1st century. Every piece of evidence, from the bloodstains to the weave pattern to the pollen grains, is interpreted differently by skeptics and believers. What makes this mystery so compelling is not just the religious significance, but what it would mean for our understanding of ancient technology. If the shroud is a medieval creation, then the artist possessed skills in textile chemistry, negative image formation, and anatomical accuracy that were centuries ahead of their time. That would rewrite the history of medieval art and science. If it is authentic, then we face an even greater puzzle. How was the image formed, and what does it tell us about the events it records? Either way, resolving the question would have profound implications, not only for faith but for the study of materials, ancient fabrics, and the limits of what we can know about the past. Until new testing methods, perhaps involving carbon dating of individual fibers or advanced imaging techniques, are applied, the shroud remains suspended between belief and evidence, a cloth that refuses to reveal its secret. A small clay jar found near Baghdad holds a secret that could rewrite the timeline of human invention. discovered in the 1930s during excavations at a site called Cujut Rabu. This unassuming object stands about 5 inches tall and contains a copper cylinder sealed at the bottom with asphalt, and an iron rod suspended inside that cylinder by another asphalt plug. The whole thing looks like a primitive version of a modern battery, a simple cell that could produce a small electric current when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or lemon juice. The jar dates to the Parthian or Sassanid period, roughly 2,000 years ago, long before Alessandro Volta built his first voltaic pile in 1800. The speculation that it was actually a galvanic cell used for electroplating is tantalizing. Some researchers argue that if you connected several of these jars in series, you could generate enough current to coat a thin layer of gold onto a silver surface, a technique that would explain the fine gilding on ancient Parthian and Sassanid artifacts. But the evidence is far from conclusive. No ancient texts describe such a device. No workshop has ever been found containing multiple jars wired together. And when modern experimenters have built replicas, they have produced only a weak current, barely enough to tarnish a coin, let alone plate a large object. The alternative theory holds that the jar was simply a storage container for scrolls, with the copper cylinder acting as a protective case and the iron rod as a handle or a seal. This is less exciting but more in line with the archaeological context. Similar vessels have been found elsewhere, and the materials match what was commonly used for preserving papyrus or parchment. Yet the scroll theory has its own problems. No traces of organic material have ever been found inside these jars, and the design seems unnecessarily complex for a simple scroll holder. The truth is that no definitive use has ever been proven, and similar devices are incredibly rare. Only a handful of these objects have been unearthed, and each one raises more questions than it answers. If the Baghdad battery really was a battery, it would push back the invention of electricity by nearly 2,000 years, forcing a complete rethink of ancient technological capabilities. It would mean that the Parthians or Sassanids had mastered a fundamental principle of physics that would not be rediscovered until the Enlightenment, and that they applied it to practical tasks like gilding or perhaps even medical treatments. But if it was just a container, then we are left with a clever but ordinary piece of pottery. Until another example is found with clear traces of use, or until a workshop is uncovered with a full array of these jars connected by wires, the little clay object from Baghdad sits on a museum shelf in the Iraqi National Museum, a silent challenge to everything we assume about the ancient world's mastery of nature. In the 9th century, one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations emptied its own cities. Across the lowlands of Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, the great centers of Maya culture fell silent one by one. Tikal, Palenque, Capon, each city had been home to tens of thousands of people, with towering pyramids, elaborate palaces, and thriving markets. Then, over a span of roughly 100 years, the populations dwindled, the monuments stopped being built, and the jungle began to reclaim the stone. By the year 900 CE, the classic Maya period had come to an end. But the people themselves did not vanish. Millions of Maya still live in the same region today, speaking descendants of the same languages and practicing traditions that stretch back millennia. What collapsed was not the culture but a particular form of political and urban organization. Why that system fell apart remains one of the most intensely studied puzzles in archaeology. The leading theory points to climate. Tree ring records and sediment cores from lakes in the Yucatan Peninsula show a series of severe droughts that struck the region between 800 and 1000 CE. These were not ordinary dry spells. They were prolonged megadroughts that would have shrunk harvests, dried up reservoirs, and strained every resource the Maya had. In a society that relied on intensive agriculture to feed dense urban populations, a few failed harvests could trigger a cascade of problems. Food shortages lead to malnutrition, which weakens the population and makes them more vulnerable to disease. To make things worse, the Maya had transformed their landscape on an enormous scale. They cleared vast tracts of forest for farmlands and for the lime plaster used to cover their buildings. Deforestation would have reduced rainfall even further, creating a feedback loop that worsened the drought. Soils eroded and the land became less productive. At the same time, the political system was under pressure. The classic Maya were not a single unified empire but a patchwork of rival city-states, each ruled by a divine king who claimed to control the cosmos and the rain. When the rains failed, the king's authority crumbled along with the harvest. Wars between cities became more frequent and more destructive. Instead of cooperating, they competed for shrinking resources. Trade networks that had once brought obsidian, jade, and cacao from distant regions broke down as violence disrupted travel. The entire system, so intricately interconnected, began to unravel. Each theory, drought, deforestation, war, trade collapse, fits part of the evidence, but none alone explains why the collapse was so widespread and so permanent. Some cities survived longer than others. A few, like Chichen Itza in the north, actually flourished for a time after the southern cities were abandoned. This suggests that the collapse was not a single event but a patchwork of local crises driven by similar stresses. The deeper lesson of the Maya collapse is about resilience. They were not passive victims of climate. Their choices, how they managed the land, how they organized their society, and how they responded to stress, determined their fate. Understanding exactly why the classic Maya system broke down could help modern societies think about their own vulnerabilities. We also live in a world where climate change, resource strain, and political instability interact in unpredictable ways. If we can learn from what happened in the jungles of Central America over 1,000 years ago, we might avoid repeating the same patterns. The Maya themselves never vanished. They adapted, moved, and rebuilt in new places. Their descendants still hold the memory of those grand cities, now overgrown but not forgotten. What vanished was a particular way of life, a moment of extraordinary achievement under conditions that could no longer sustain it. And as we walk through the ruins today, we are left to wonder, will our own cities one day stand as silent monuments to a similar crossing of limits? The first Australians arrived by sea, but the journey remains a mystery hidden for over 60,000 years. The continent of Australia was always separated from the rest of the world by ocean, even during the Ice Age when sea levels dropped dramatically. The earliest evidence of human presence on this landmass now points to dates exceeding 65,000 years, far older than the peopling of the Americas or Europe. What makes this so remarkable is that these first settlers had to cross a stretch of open water, at least 50 miles wide, to reach the continent. They did not walk across a land bridge because there never was one. This means the world's first seafarers, the first people to deliberately build watercraft and navigate open ocean, may not have been the Polynesians or the early Mediterraneans but the ancestors of indigenous Australians. The puzzle is how they did it. No wreckage of their boats has ever been found. No clear archaeological traces of the vessels they used survive from that remote time. We are left with only theories and comparisons to later maritime cultures. One leading idea is island hopping, that early humans moved through the islands of Southeast Asia, each step bringing them closer to the continent. During periods of low sea level, many of these islands were connected, forming a landmass called Sunda. From the edge of Sunda, the final crossing to Australia and New Guinea, which were joined as a single landmass called Sahul, required at least 1 or 2 significant sea voyages. Another theory suggests accidental drift, that groups of people were carried by currents while fishing or exploring, and they landed on the Australian coast by chance. If that is how it happened, then the first settlers did not plan their voyage. They were survivors of a maritime accident. but the evidence of long-term occupation at sites like Majidbeb in northern Australia, with its stone tools, grinding stones, and ochre fragments, suggests intentional, repeated settlement, not a single lucky drift. That implies knowledge of currents, seasons, and perhaps even the stars. What kind of watercraft could have made this crossing? The most likely candidates are bamboo rafts or dugout canoes, but neither leaves a clear fossil record after millennia of decay. Researchers have built replica rafts and tested them against ancient currents, proving the crossing was possible, but not proving what actually happened. Solving this mystery would do more than fill a gap in history. It would reveal the cognitive abilities and maritime skills of early modern humans at a time when most of the world was still empty. It would show that the first Australians possessed the planning, communication, and risk-taking required to launch a deliberate voyage across a dangerous sea. Their success would rewrite the story of human innovation, pushing back the date of purposeful ocean travel by tens of thousands of years. The answer may lie beneath the waves of the Arafura Sea, where ancient coastlines are now submerged. Someday, a diver or an underwater drone might find the remains of a bamboo raft or a carved paddle or a stone anchor and unlock the secret of the first crossing. Until then, the ancestors of those who have lived on this continent for over 60 millennia remain the first great sailors of human history. Their boats vanished, their journey remembered only in the land they reached. The Great Sphinx of Giza stares eastward across the desert, its lion body and human face carved from a single ridge of limestone. For centuries, its silence has invited speculation, but one question refuses to settle. How old is it really? The official story, taught in textbooks and museum exhibits, places its construction around 2500 BC, during the 4th dynasty, under the pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid rises just behind it. The evidence for this link is strong. The Sphinx sits within Khafre's pyramid complex, and a nearby temple bears inscriptions that reference him, but there is a problem with the stone itself. Along the body and the enclosure walls, the erosion does not look like the typical wind-blown sand damage seen on other Old Kingdom structures. Instead, the weathering appears to be water erosion, deep vertical fissures and rounded contours that suggest centuries of rainfall, not sandblasting. Egypt's climate has been dry for the last 5,000 years, but before that, during the predynastic period, the region received far more rain. So the argument goes, if the Sphinx was carved during a wetter era, its origins could be much older, perhaps as far back as 7000 BC or even earlier. This theory was championed by geologist Robert Schoch in the 1990s, who argued that the patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure match the effects of prolonged precipitation, not wind erosion. He also pointed to the Sphinx's head, which is disproportionately small compared to its body, suggesting it may have been recarved from an earlier, larger lion statue. Mainstream Egyptologists counter that the erosion could have been caused by other factors, such as the action of groundwater seeping through the limestone, or by occasional heavy rainstorms in the otherwise arid climate over the last 4.5 millennia. They also note that the Sphinx is part of a larger complex with clear dynastic connections, and that no archaeological evidence supports a predynastic origin. The debate has become deeply polarized, with each side accusing the other of ignoring evidence. The implications of an earlier date are staggering. If the Sphinx was built long before the rise of the pharaonic state, it would mean that a sophisticated civilization capable of monumental stone carving existed in Egypt thousands of years earlier than we believe. That would force a complete rethinking of the timeline of human development, not just in Egypt but globally. It would raise questions about who these earlier people were, what they believed, and why they chose to carve a colossal creature from the bedrock. The controversy is not just about a statue. It is about the very foundation of our historical chronology, which rests on the assumption that civilization advanced in a steady, linear progression from simple to complex. An older Sphinx would shatter that line, opening a door to a past we have barely begun to imagine. For now, the stones keep their secret, and the Sphinx continues to gaze into the horizon, waiting for an answer that only deeper excavation or new dating techniques might provide. Across the dense jungles of Costa Rica, hundreds of perfectly rounded stone spheres lie scattered, their purpose lost to time. Some are no larger than a bowling ball, while others weigh several tons and measure over 2 meters in diameter. They were carved by pre-Columbian societies between roughly 300 and 1500 CE, using only stone tools and patient skill. The precision is astonishing. Many are almost perfectly spherical, within fractions of an inch of a true mathematical sphere. Yet the people who made them left no written records, no depictions of the spheres in use, and no clear context for why they were created. Adding to the mystery, most of the spheres were moved from their original locations in the 20th century, either by treasure hunters, plantation workers, or well-meaning collectors. The original arrangements, which might have held the key to their meaning, were destroyed. What little we know comes from early accounts and a handful of undisturbed sites. The leading theories for their purpose are as varied as the spheres themselves. Some researchers see them as status symbols, markers of wealth or power displayed in front of important buildings or along pathways. Others propose astronomical alignments, suggesting the spheres were arranged to mark solstices, equinoxes, or the positions of stars. A third theory interprets them as symbols of social organization, perhaps representing the hierarchy of a community, with larger spheres belonging to higher-ranking individuals or clans. Each idea has supporters, but none has enough evidence to stand alone. The spheres are found in groups, often in lines, circles, or clusters, but the original patterns are now too fragmented to read. What makes this puzzle so compelling is what it would reveal about ancient Central America if solved. The societies that built them, such as the Diquis culture, were not the great empires of Mexico or Peru. They were smaller, more localized groups, but their ability to organize the labor and skill required to carve and transport multi-ton spheres suggests a level of social complexity that challenges the conventional view of the region. If the spheres were symbols of authority or territorial markers, they would indicate a clear system of leadership and land ownership. If they were astronomical, they would show a sophisticated understanding of the heavens. Understanding their true purpose would rewrite the story of how these societies were structured, how they governed themselves, and what they valued. Until more undisturbed sites are found, or until new dating methods can link the spheres to specific activities, they remain one of the most enigmatic puzzles in the archaeological world, silent witnesses to a people who shaped stone with remarkable precision, then vanished into the green canopy, leaving only these mysterious orbs behind. On the island of Crete, a fired clay disc holds a script no one can read. It was discovered in 1908 inside the ruins of the Minoan palace of Phaistos, buried under ash and rubble from an ancient destruction. The disc is about 6 inches across, made of fine clay, and on both sides a spiral of symbols has been pressed into the surface using individual stamps. This is what makes it extraordinary. Each symbol was stamped one at a time, meaning the creator had a set of pre-carved stamps, a technique that would not be seen again in the Western world until the invention of movable type printing nearly 3,000 years later. The disc contains 45 distinct symbols, repeated in clusters that form a continuous spiraling text, and yet, despite over a century of effort, no one has been able to read a single word of it. The script is unique. It bears no clear relation to any known writing system from the ancient Mediterranean, not to Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoans themselves, nor to Linear B, which was used for early Greek. It does not match Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hittite cuneiform, or any Semitic alphabet. It stands completely alone. Over the years, dozens of scholars have proposed translations. Some have argued it is a form of Linear A, written in a different style. Others see it as an early version of Greek, or a syllabary for a lost language of the Bronze Age Aegean. A few have even claimed it is a prayer, a hymn, or a calendar based on astronomical alignments. But every proposed translation has been met with skepticism, because each relies on assumptions that cannot be verified without a second text to compare it to. And that is the core of the mystery. No other object bearing this same script has ever been found. It is a message with no context, a voice with no companion. The possibility that it is a hoax has been raised repeatedly. Some critics point to its pristine condition, the fact that it was found in a layer of destruction but shows no wear from use, and the suspicious convenience of its unique script. If it were a forgery, it would have been crafted by someone with an extraordinary knowledge of ancient stamping techniques and a desire to create a puzzle for future generations. But most experts now accept it as genuine, based on the circumstances of its excavation and the consistency of its materials with Minoan clay and firing methods. The hoax theory, while tantalizing, seems less likely than the simpler explanation that the disc is a rare survival from a lost tradition of writing, perhaps a single document that was never meant to be part of a larger corpus. What would decipherment mean? If the disc could be read, it would open a direct window into the Minoan world, a civilization that built magnificent palaces, traded across the Mediterranean, and worshipped a goddess whose name we do not even know. The text might be a religious hymn, a record of a treaty, a list of offerings, or even a traveling merchant's inventory. It might reveal the structure of the Minoan language itself, which remains one of the great missing pieces of ancient linguistics. Alternatively, if the script proves to be a syllabary for a known language like early Greek, it would confirm that writing technology was more widespread and inventive than we currently assume. And if it was indeed created with movable stamps, it would push the concept of printing back by over a millennium, forcing a complete revision of the history of communication. The disk's singularity is both frustrating and tantalizing. It is the only known example of its kind, a brilliant flash of innovation that left no descendants, no copies, no imitations. It sits in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, a silent spiral waiting for someone to find the key. What if the answer lies not in comparing it to other scripts, but in understanding it as a standalone artifact, a code made to be read only once? Until that day comes, the Phaistos disc remains the loneliest book in the world, a message that may never be answered. In the winter of 373 BC, the ancient Greek city of Helike was thriving, a wealthy port and a center of worship for the god Poseidon. Then, in a single night, it was gone. Ancient historians like Strabo and Pausanias recorded that a massive earthquake shook the region, followed by a towering wave that swept the entire city into the sea. For over 2,000 years, the story was dismissed as myth, a cautionary tale about divine punishment for human arrogance. But in the 1990s, a team of archaeologists led by Dora Katsanopoulou and Stephen Soter finally located the remains of Helike buried beneath a coastal lagoon in the northern Peloponnese. They found streets, buildings, walls, and pottery, all preserved under layers of silt and water. The site was exactly where the ancient text said it would be, submerged beneath a shallow lake that had formed over the ruins. Since then, excavations have revealed a remarkably well-preserved slice of classical Greek life. Houses stand with their floors intact. Coins, tools, and household objects lie where they were dropped. Streets run in neat grids, showing a city that was planned and orderly, but the work is far from complete. The lagoon covers a large area, and much of the city likely remains hidden beneath the waterlogged sediment. The central question is whether the visible ruins represent the entire settlement or only a portion of it. Some researchers believe the main public buildings, the temples, the agora, and the administrative center may lie deeper, buried under even thicker layers of sediment. A complete excavation of Helike would be a dream for historians, because the city was abandoned so suddenly. It offers a frozen moment in time, a snapshot of everyday life in the 4th century BC. Unlike Pompeii, which was buried by volcanic ash, Helike was submerged in water, a different kind of preservation that could reveal organic materials like wood, leather, and food that normally decay. It could show us how a Greek city actually functioned, not just its monuments but its markets, its workshops, its water systems, and its homes. It might even contain written records, wooden tablets or papyrus scrolls that have survived in the oxygen-poor mud. Such a discovery would transform our understanding of classical Greek urbanism, filling gaps left by other sites that were abandoned gradually or stripped of their contents over time. But the excavation is painstaking and slow. The site lies under several feet of water and mud, and it is vulnerable to storms and rising sea levels. Each season, archaeologists must pump out water and carefully remove sediment, working against the clock. The question remains, is what we have found the whole story, or is the true heart of Helike still waiting beneath the lagoon, sealed in the mud like a message in a bottle? Until the full extent of the city is revealed, Helike remains a nearly complete time capsule, its secrets held by the very water that once erased it. On the coast of Brittany in northwestern France, rows of ancient stones march across the landscape for miles. These are the Carnac stones, a vast collection of nearly 4,000 standing stones arranged in 12 roughly parallel lines that stretch for over a mile and a half. They were raised during the Neolithic period, around 4500 BCE, making them older than the pyramids of Egypt and roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. The sheer scale is staggering. The largest alignments contain hundreds of individual menhirs, some weighing over 30 tons, and yet, for all their monumental presence, we have no idea why they were put there. No written records from the builders survive, of course, but even more frustratingly, the stones themselves have been moved, rearranged, and repurposed over thousands of years. In the 19th century, local farmers cleared sections for agriculture, sometimes toppling stones or using them as building materials. Later, amateur archaeologists and even the French military, who used the area as a training ground, shifted some stones for convenience. The original arrangement is lost, and what we see today is a mix of ancient intention and human intervention. Despite this, scholars have proposed several competing theories. The oldest explanation sees the alignments as an astronomical observatory. Some of the rows appear to point toward the rising sun at the solstices, and the overall orientation suggests a careful relationship to the movements of the sun and moon. Proponents argue that the Carnac stones functioned as a giant calendar, helping Neolithic communities track the seasons for planting and harvest, or for timing major religious festivals. A second theory interprets the lines as ritual avenues, processional routes that guided worshippers from one sacred site to another. The stones may have marked a path for ceremonies, perhaps leading from a settlement to a nearby temple or burial mound. The straightness of the rows, the uniformity of spacing, and the deliberate placement of larger stones at intervals all support this idea. A third proposal suggests territorial markers, a way for different groups to define boundaries, claim land, or display social status. In this view, the alignments were like ancient signposts saying, "This is our territory, our ancestors are buried here, our gods watch over this ground." Each theory has strengths and weaknesses. The astronomical alignment theory lacks precision. The solstice alignments are approximate, and the stones cover too wide an area for a simple calendar. The ritual avenue idea fits the spatial layout, but no clear starting or ending points have been identified. The territorial marker theory explains the scale, but why build such massive structures when simpler markers would have sufficed? The truth is that without written records or undisturbed context, every interpretation remains a best guess. What makes the Carnac stones so important is what they would reveal if we ever understood them. They represent one of the largest and most complex ceremonial landscapes in prehistoric Europe, a place where entire communities came together to build something with no practical function. That choice to spend generations raising thousands of tons of stone speaks to a shared belief system, a set of values and rituals that united scattered groups across the region. Deciphering the purpose of the Carnac alignments would unlock that belief system, showing us how Neolithic people organized their society, how they worshipped, and what they thought about their place in the world. It would be like finding a lost language of landscape, a grammar carved in stone that explains the minds of the people who built it. Until that day, the Rose of Brittany stand as a silent question, a question that stretches across the fields and into the deep past, waiting for an answer that may never come. In the canyons of the American Southwest, entire cities cling to cliff faces. These are not small settlements, they are sprawling complexes of stone and mortar, tucked into alcoves hundreds of feet above the desert floor, some with multiple stories and hundreds of rooms. They were built by a people we now call the ancestral Pueblones, once known as the Anasazi. For centuries, they thrived in the Four Corners region where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash on the mesa tops. They crafted intricate pottery and woven baskets. They built roads and trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. And then, around the year 1290, they began to leave. Within a single generation, the great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, Choco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly were silent. The people did not vanish. Their descendants live today in pueblos like Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi, carrying forward traditions that stretch back centuries. But the question of why they abandoned those spectacular homes has never been fully answered. The most widely accepted explanation points to a prolonged drought. Tree ring records from the region show a severe dry spell that began in the late 12th century and intensified in the late 13th century, exactly when the depopulation occurred. Without reliable rainfall, the maize harvests that sustained the large communities would have failed repeatedly. But drought alone does not explain why they left places that had been occupied for generations. After all, drought was not new. They had weathered dry periods before. Something else must have pushed the system past its breaking point. Over centuries of intensive farming, the ancestral Pueblones had transformed the landscape. They cut down forests for building materials and firewood. They diverted streams for irrigation. The soil became depleted, losing its fertility. As the population grew, the demand on resources increased, and the land could no longer support the dense communities that had been built. This combination of environmental stress and resource strain is what many researchers call a sustainability crisis. When the drought hit, there was no margin for error. At the same time, there is evidence of growing social pressures. Skeletal remains from the period show signs of malnutrition and increased violence. Defensive structures appear on mesa tops. Some sites were fortified. The Chacon system, which had once connected dozens of communities through a network of roads and shared ceremonial architecture, seems to have fractured. Trade routes collapsed. The authority of the leaders who had organized the great public works faded. Communities fractured into smaller groups that could no longer cooperate. Each theory, drought, deforestation, soil depletion, social breakdown, explains part of the picture, but none alone accounts for the speed and completeness of the exodus. Why did they not stay and adapt as they had for centuries? Some researchers suggest that the combination of stresses created a perfect storm. When the rains failed and the soil gave out, the social fabric unraveled faster than anyone could respond. The people did not disappear, they moved. Some went south to the Rio Grande Valley, where water was more reliable. Others joined smaller communities that had survived in more sustainable ways. The cliff dwellings were left to the wind and the sun, preserved by the very dryness that had driven their builders away. What makes this mystery so urgent is its relevance to our own time. Here was a sophisticated society that achieved remarkable things in a challenging environment. They built monumental architecture, developed complex trade networks, and sustained a dense population. But their success contained the seeds of their own undoing. They pushed their resources to the limit, and when the environment shifted, the system could not adapt quickly enough. Their story is not a tale of failure but a cautionary one, a lesson about the limits of growth and the importance of sustainability. It asks us to consider what happens when a society outgrows the land that supports it, and what choices we might make to avoid a similar fate. The cliff dwellings remain, standing in the silence of the canyons, a reminder that the most impressive civilizations are also the most fragile. On a small Indonesian island, a discovery in 2003 turned the story of human evolution upside down. Archaeologists working in a cave called Liang Bua found the remains of a tiny hominin standing just over 3 feet tall, with a brain about the size of a grapefruit. They named it Homo floresiensis, but it quickly became known as the Hobbit, and the biggest shock was the date. These individuals lived as recently as 50,000 years ago. That means they were alive at the same time as our own species, Homo sapiens, was spreading across the globe. The existence of a completely different human species, living so recently and in such a remote location, raises fundamental questions about our family tree. But from the very beginning, the Hobbit sparked fierce debate. Some researchers argued that it was not a separate species at all, but rather a group of modern humans who suffered from a disease like microcephaly, which causes a small brain and short stature. Others proposed that it was a dwarfed descendant of an earlier hominin, perhaps Homo erectus, that had arrived on Flores and, isolated on the island, evolved a smaller body over generations to cope with limited resources. This process, called island dwarfism, is well known in animals like elephants and deer, but it had never been proven for humans. The most extraordinary claim is that Homo floresiensis actually represents an entirely separate branch of the human family, one that split off long before our own lineage emerged. If that is true, it would mean that multiple human species coexisted in Southeast Asia much later than we ever imagined, and here is where the mystery deepens. The Hobbit made stone tools. Archaeologists found simple but effective flakes and choppers alongside its remains. This means that a creature with a brain only a third the size of ours could still craft tools, hunt, and survive. That shatters the long-held assumption that tool-making required a large brain. It forces us to rethink what it means to be human and what cognitive abilities are truly necessary for complex behavior. More discoveries on Flores could clarify the picture. Perhaps other islands in the Indonesian archipelago hold similar secrets, other lost branches of the human family that evolved in isolation and left their mark in stone and bone. Every new fossil suggests that the story of our own species is not a straight line of progress but a tangled bush of experiments, most of which ended in silence. The Hobbit lived on Flores for hundreds of thousands of years, and then it vanished. Why? Climate change, competition with modern humans, or simply the fragility of a small population on an island? We do not know, but as we dig deeper into the caves of Southeast Asia, we may find that our own rise to dominance was not inevitable, but a story full of near misses, encounters with others, and a past far stranger than we ever imagined. High in the Andes above Cusco, stones weighing over 100 tons fit together like puzzle pieces. The Inca fortress of Sacsayhuaman was built without mortar, without iron tools, and without the wheel. Yet its massive polygonal blocks lock so tightly that a blade of grass cannot slip between them. 5 centuries later, engineers still cannot explain exactly how it was done. The stones themselves tell part of the story. They are irregular in shape with many faces and angles, yet each one was carved to interlock perfectly with its neighbors. This design was not just for show. In an earthquake zone, the joints allow the walls to settle and shift without collapsing. The blocks dance with the ground, then settle back into place. That is a level of seismic engineering that modern builders sometimes struggle to achieve. But the real puzzle is how the Inca achieved such precision without metal tools or written plans. The quarries for the largest stones are located miles away, across deep valleys and steep ridges. The traditional explanation relies on sheer manpower. Thousands of workers may have dragged the blocks on wooden sledges over rollers, using ramps and levers to raise them into position. Experimental archaeology has shown that a large team can move a multi-ton stone this way, but it requires an immense labor force and days of effort for a single block. And that is only the transportation. The shaping is an even greater mystery. The polygonal design demands that each face be carved to match its neighbor's unique contour. This is not a matter of cutting straight edges. It requires constant fitting and refitting, grinding the stone against its neighbor until the surfaces mate perfectly. Some researchers propose that the Inca used trial and error, repeatedly lifting and lowering each block, scraping away high spots until the fit was flawless. Others suggest they used abrasives like sand and water to wear down the contact surfaces over time. A third theory points to lost techniques, perhaps involving plant acids or heat treatment to soften the stone, but no evidence supports such methods. What makes Sacsayhuaman so baffling is that no modern team has ever fully replicated the feat on the same scale and precision. We can move large stones with machines, but to carve and fit them as the Inca did, using only stone hammers and bronze chisels, has never been achieved. The fortress stands as a monument to a kind of knowledge that may have been passed down orally through generations, a craft so refined that it left no trace beyond the walls themselves. The Inca did not write down their building methods. They did not leave blueprints or manuals. Their wisdom was embodied in the stone, and when the Spanish arrived, that knowledge died with the last master builders. The walls of Sacsayhuaman remain silent and stubborn, waiting for someone to understand the hands that raised them. They are a testament not just to power but to patience, to a people who understood that true strength lies in how things join together, not in how they stand alone. In a granite quarry near Aswan, a colossal monument never left the ground. The unfinished obelisk is still attached to the bedrock, its enormous length stretching over 130 feet. If it had been completed, it would have weighed nearly 1,200 tons, making it the largest single stone monument ever attempted by the ancient Egyptians. But the work stopped partway through, and the reason is written into the stone itself. Deep fractures run through the granite, flaws that would have doomed the obelisk the moment it was lifted. The ancient quarrymen had to abandon their project when they realized the stone was unsound. This single failure offers an extraordinary window into how the Egyptians actually shaped and extracted these massive blocks. The unfinished obelisk is like a frozen moment in the construction process. We can see the trenches carved around its sides, the marks of the dolerite pounders used to chip away the granite, and the careful planning that went into separating the monolith from the earth. The cracks reveal the limits of their knowledge. Despite centuries of experience, they could not always predict where a hidden flaw would appear. The question of why they abandoned the project seems straightforward: structural failure. But that answer only leads to deeper questions. Why attempt such a massive piece in the first place? What drove the ambition to carve a single stone larger than any that had ever been raised? Some scholars suggest the obelisk was intended for a specific temple or to honor a particular pharaoh, perhaps Hatshep, Sut, or Thutmose III. Others argue that the project was simply too ambitious, that the desire to surpass all previous monuments overreached the practical limits of the technology. There is also the possibility that shifting priorities within the royal court or the economy redirected resources elsewhere. A pharaoh might have died, or a new religious focus might have made such a monument less urgent. What makes the unfinished obelisk so valuable is that it preserves a process that is otherwise invisible. Completed obelisks stand smooth and polished, their quarry origins erased. But here we see the raw stages, the rough shaping, the test cuts, the evidence of how workers organized their labor. The site reveals the scale of the workforce needed, the tools they used, and the time required for such an undertaking. Understanding why this particular obelisk was abandoned, and what it tells us about the planning and logistics of pharaonic monument building, would illuminate the entire system that produced the great obelisks of Egypt. It would show us how decisions were made, how risk was assessed, and how ambition could collide with the stubborn reality of stone. The unfinished obelisk remains a silent lesson in the limits of power, a reminder that even the most confident builders must sometimes yield to the ground beneath them. From the hidden fracture in a half-carved obelisk to the silent rows of stones in Brittany, every mystery on this journey shares a common thread. They all point to the same truth: history is not a closed book. It is a vast, unfinished story that we are still learning to read. Again and again, these puzzles have shown us that human ingenuity runs deeper than we ever assumed, that our ancestors possessed knowledge and skills we have not fully recovered. They have also revealed the fragility of complex societies, the way that success can breed vulnerability, and how quickly the threads of civilization can unravel when the environment shifts or social bonds break. But most of all, these 30 questions remind us of the limits of our own understanding. Every generation thinks it has a firm grasp on the past, and every generation is humbled by a new discovery. A single excavation, a single translation, a single lucky find can overturn centuries of assumptions and force us to rewrite entire chapters of history. That is the thrill of archaeology. It is not a settled science. It is a field of active discovery where the ground beneath our feet still holds secrets that could change everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from. If this journey has sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing to follow future breakthroughs as they happen, and share your own favorite unsolved mystery in the comments. What question would you most like to see answered in your lifetime? The past is still speaking. We just have to be willing to listen.